Sighting 1. The Bluff Creek Lookout, 1959. The pre-Patterson encounter. Before the famous film, before grainy frames became icons, before folklore absorbed the name Bigfoot into its bones, there was a small group of men working the forests above Bluff Creek in Northern California who whispered about something else entirely. Not a monster, not an ape, something that moved with intention. The earliest of those whispers comes from 1959, 2 full years before the Patterson-Gimlin sighting would turn the region into a mythic landscape. And unlike later stories, this one never made the news. It lived quietly in the logbooks and fading recollections of a fire lookout crew stationed along the rugged ridges between Louse Camp and Blue Creek Mountain. The account comes from a lookout named Howard Howie Carson, a former Korean War radio man who later spent 4 decades with the U.S. Forest Service. In 1998, 6 months before his passing, Howie shared a story with his niece, who later passed it along to a small oral history archive in Eureka. The story was remarkably consistent and chilling. In late August of 1959, Howie was assigned to the Blue Ridge Lookout, a tiny wooden tower perched high above the maze-like creek systems below. Nights were usually full of forest noise, tree frogs, insects, the shifting creak of pines bowing under mountain wind. But on August 22nd, the forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. Howie wrote, "The woods held their breath, even the creek down below seemed to hush itself. At 2:14 a.m., the metal stairs beneath the lookout shook, not violently, but with a faint, rhythmic tremor. Footsteps, heavy ones. Howie grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the balcony. Below, illuminated by moonlight filtering through the canopy, stood a figure on the service trail. At first he thought it was a black bear standing upright, but then it turned, and the silhouette snapped into terrifying clarity. Howie described it as massively built, perhaps 7 feet tall, shoulders as wide as a refrigerator door, arms far longer than any human's, hanging nearly to mid-thigh, entire body covered in coarse dark hair, a head that sat low and forward on the shoulders, a stride that was slow, deliberate, and operator-like, not animalistic, feet that pressed deep into dry earth with impossible weight. The creature wasn't wandering. It wasn't confused. It was walking directly toward the stairs of the tower. Howie backed inside and quietly shut the door. The lookout tower was sturdy enough to withstand storms, but not built with the idea of giant hominins in mind. He listened. The footsteps approached the base of the tower, then stopped. For 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then the creature exhaled, a long, slow, resonant breath that vibrated through the floorboards like distant bass. Howie said, "It wasn't a growl, it wasn't a grunt, it was breath. Thick, human breath." The creature placed a hand, an enormous hand, on the first step. The entire structure gave a faint groan. And then it stepped back, not in fear, but in a strange, almost respectful hesitation, as if, sensing the lookout was a human boundary, it chose not to cross. It turned, walked back into the brush with astonishing smoothness, and vanished into the pines. The silence slowly lifted. Insects resumed. The creek murmured again. The forest exhaled. When Howie descended at sunrise, he found footprints far larger than any man's boot, pressed deep into soil, broken branches at a height no black bear could reach, a single tuft of coarse dark hair caught on the corner of the stair rail, the faint odor of something musky, earthy, and undeniably animal. Howie never filed a report. He knew what would happen. Instead, he left a 3-sentence note in the margin of the station logbook. "Someone walked through last night. Very big. Did not want trouble." 2 years later, when Patterson and Gimlin filmed their creature downstream, Howie was one of the few who didn't laugh. He simply nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that's about the size of it." Sighting 2. The Chilcotin River Runner, 1964. The Rancher's Chase. Some sightings live in the quiet spaces between ranch land and wilderness, places where human presence thins just enough for something older, stronger, and more elusive to slip through undetected. British Columbia's Chilcotin Plateau, 1964, was one such place. A vast mosaic of pine forest, bluff-lined rivers, open grasslands, and horse trails that disappeared into canyons no rancher willingly entered alone. The second sighting in this series belongs to Tom Caribou, a Chilcotin cattleman known by locals for being level-headed, stubborn, and immune to tall tales. Tom had run cattle along the Chilcotin River east of Alexis Creek his entire life. He tracked wolves, fought off cougars, and could spot a bear print from horseback at full trot. He wasn't easily shaken, but the events of June 7th, 1964, left him shaken for life. Tom was riding his roan mare, Red Willow, checking fence lines along a high river bluff. The air smelled of sun-warmed sage. The Chilcotin River shimmered below, a glacier-fed ribbon slicing through rugged canyon walls. Red Willow stopped abruptly. Her ears pinned back. She snorted, deep, fearful, refusing to take another step. Tom followed her gaze. Across the bluff, nearly 200 meters away, a figure was running. Not jogging, not wandering, running full stride, moving parallel to the river, but angling upslope toward the tree line. At first Tom thought it was a man, maybe a hunter or trapper, but as the figure moved into clearer light, several things became horribly apparent. It was huge, well over 7 feet tall. Its arms swung nearly to the knees. It ran with a strange, powerful, loping gait. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark hair. Its feet looked massive, kicking up dust in wide arcs. And, most impossible of all, it was outrunning a horse at full gallop. Tom swore out loud, snapped the reins, and Red Willow surged forward. She didn't want to, but instinct and training pushed her into pursuit. The figure heard the horse and it glanced back, Tom later said. That one looked near stopped my heart, not an animal, not a man, something between. The creature didn't change course, it accelerated. The bluff narrowed dangerously, sheer drop on one side, dense bush on the other. The creature navigated this terrain with shocking agility, placing its feet with the precision of a long-distance runner who had memorized every stone and root. Tom lost sight of it at a bend in the path, but the dust trail told him everything. It was still ahead, still moving fast. Red Willow wouldn't go farther. She reared, nearly throwing him, and refused to advance another step. Tom dismounted, tied the reins to a birch sapling, and drew his rifle, not to shoot, but because something primal told him to have it at hand. The dust settled. Silence. Then from the ridge above came the sound of rock clacks. 2 stones tapped together. Slow, measured, deliberate. Tom turned, and there it stood, not running now, standing on a ledge, chest heaving from exertion, staring down at him with astonishing intelligence. Tom described the moment. Shoulders wider than any man, chest rising and falling like a bellows, arms long and thick, hands curled around 2 smooth river stones, face broad and dark, framed by a crest of tangled hair, eyes deep amber, unblinking, a posture that radiated strength, confidence, and warning. The creature tapped the stones again. Clack, clack, clack. Then it dropped to all fours for a brief instant, launching itself up the remaining slope in a blur, disappearing over the ridgeline with such speed Tom could barely track it. Tom reached the ridge minutes later. The creature was gone, but the evidence wasn't. Massive footprints pressed deeply into soft earth, wide forefoot, clear toe splay. A patch of crushed yellow wildflowers flattened by an enormous weight. A broken juniper branch snapped 9 feet off the ground, and on a flat rock, one of the stones the creature had used. Smooth, river-worn, but carried far uphill from the water. Tom quietly pocketed the stone, later keeping it in a small leather pouch he never showed anyone outside his family. That night, he wrote only one line in his ranch logbook, an entry his daughter found decades later. "I chased it today, couldn't catch it, good thing." He never attempted to track the creature again. He never returned to that section of bluff alone, and Red Willow refused, for the rest of her life, to take that trail. Sighting 3. The Columbia River Toll Booth Incident, 1972. The Night of the Two Shadows. Some sightings take place on lonely back roads and forgotten logging trails. Others happen deep in wilderness that humans rarely penetrate. But every so often, something steps across the boundary into a place where civilization feels too close for comfort. This sighting occurred not in the mountains, not in the woods, but beside the busy hum of the Columbia River Highway in 1972, near a toll booth station just east of Stevenson, Washington. It is one of the strangest accounts in modern Bigfoot lore, because the witness wasn't hiking, hunting, or camping. He was working a night shift, alone, under bright electric lights, and he was paid to notice things. The witness, known publicly only as EJ in archived interviews, was a Korean War veteran now working nights at a toll station that stood about 50 yards from the river's edge. His job was monotonous: collect fees, mark plates, wave drivers through. Most nights were uneventful, but on March 3, 1972, at approximately 1:17 a.m., something moved just outside the halo of the floodlights. At first, EJ thought it was a vandal or drunk driver wandering off the shoulder. He grabbed the station flashlight, stepped out onto the platform, and shone the beam into the darkness beyond the last lamp. The light caught one shadow and then another. Two figures, not one, and they weren't human. The first figure stood between the road and the river, just beyond the reach of the light. EJ described it with the same careful precision he used in military reports. Around 8 feet tall, shoulders impossibly broad, entire body covered in dark hair that gleamed slightly under the beam, arms long enough that the hands nearly grazed its knees, head domed and forward set with no visible neck, stance relaxed but ready, like a sprinter waiting for a signal, eyes reflecting pale green from the flashlight, calm, steady, aware. The tall figure didn't move, it simply watched. EJ whispered under his breath, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph." Then he saw the second shadow, near the side of the toll booth, half hidden behind the trash dumpster. Something crouched, much smaller, maybe 4.5 feet tall, but built in the same uncanny way. Thick torso, long arms, dense hair, a face too flat and human-like to belong to an animal, and hands, small, broad hands, sifting through discarded wrappers and containers. The smaller one seemed nervous. It sniffed, pawed lightly at the dumpster's bottom edge, then froze. It had noticed EJ. It turned its head sharply toward him, eyes glinting with a jittery intelligence. It gave a soft, whistling chirp, a sound EJ later compared to a bird's call, but deeper. The tall figure answered with a single, low rumble, a vocalization, not just noise, but communication. EJ felt himself stop breathing. The small one rose from its crouch. It stood fully upright for only a second, but that was enough to send a chill through EJ. Its proportions were identical to the tall one, just scaled down, like a juvenile. It took 2 quick steps toward the larger figure. That's when it happened. Both figures turned toward the river and in almost perfect synchronization, stepped over the guardrail and descended the steep riprap slope. Not scrambling, not slipping. Walking, smooth, confident, unhurried. Within moments their dark forms blended into the tree line. The night consumed them. EJ didn't sleep that morning. He didn't go home. He waited for daylight. At dawn he returned to the spot near the dumpster. He found small, broad footprints in damp soil. A partially crushed soda can, bent inward as if squeezed by powerful fingers. A smear of dark, coarse hair fibers stuck to the dumpster hinge. to parallel scrapes on the guardrail, consistent with very large hands gripping it while stepping over. And on the rocks leading toward the river, massive, bare footprints, spaced far apart. He took a Polaroid of the prints, but the toll station supervisor confiscated it after hearing the story, telling him never to mention the incident publicly. For decades, EJ kept silent. In a late-life interview for an oral history project, he finally told the whole story and ended with a haunting reflection. One was tall, one was small. Family, I think. And I realized then, whatever these things are, they aren't hiding from us. We just don't watch the places they walk. Sighting 4. The Noatak Valley Watcher, 1978. The Hunter Who Wasn't Alone. If there is anywhere on Earth where something could live without being discovered, it's Alaska's Noatak Valley, a place so vast and untouched that even seasoned bush pilots call parts of it the blank. Rolling tundra, jagged ridgelines, cold rivers that braid and unbraid with every melt season. A silence so deep it feels like pressure on the ears. In 1978, this land was even more remote than it is today, and it was here, while hunting caribou north of the Noatak River, that Henry Kalloch, an Inupiaq subsistence hunter from Kotzebue, saw something he never expected, something he never spoke about publicly until late in life. The Kalloch family later shared the story with a cultural researcher documenting Arctic oral histories. Henry's account was always the same: calm, factual, and delivered with the quiet sobriety of a man accustomed to reading the land better than most people read books. Henry was returning upriver after a long day of tracking a caribou herd. His sled carried meat. His rifle was slung across his back. The sun hovered low on the horizon, the kind of prolonged Arctic dusk where shadows stretch for miles. That's when Henry noticed something wrong. The land was quiet, too quiet. Ravens had gone silent. Foxes stayed hidden. Even the wind seemed to die in mid-breath. Henry wrote later, "The valley felt like it was watching itself, as if something had taken the place of the animals. At first he thought it was a bear, or a wolf pack shadowing him. But then he saw it. On a low ridge above the river, silhouetted against the flattened amber light, stood a figure. At first it looked like a man in heavy winter furs. But as Henry narrowed his eyes, details took shape. Very large, easily over 8 feet tall. Thick-chested and long-armed, with a torso shaped like a cold-weather runner. Covered head to toe in dense dark hair, not cloth. Skin visible on the face and hands, dark, weathered, alive. A slight forward lean, posture built for pushing through Arctic wind. A stillness too perfect for any bear, wolf, or man. The figure stood with one hand resting on a boulder, watching, not curious, studying. Henry raised his hand to shield his eyes from the low glare. The creature mirrored the gesture, slowly, deliberately, as if mocking or mimicking or simply acknowledging him. Henry's breath caught. Not animal, he thought, not man, something between. His sled dogs began to whine, low and anxious, pulling their tails in tight. None barked. They already knew. Henry began moving again, slowly, keeping his eyes forward but glancing sideways toward the ridge. The figure stepped from the ridge and descended toward him. Not aggressively, not with speed, but with a calm, measured confidence, like a large man approaching a smaller one, wanting to see him up close. The creature stopped about 40 meters away, close enough for Henry to see. Heavy brow ridge casting deep shadows over the eyes, nose broad and flattened, similar to Arctic-adapted humans but much larger. Lips slightly parted, breath steaming rhythmically into the cold air. Hands, huge, human-like hands, relaxing at its sides, fingers thick and strong. Henry didn't raise his rifle. He later said, "I knew it would not help, not against something that looked that sure of itself." The creature sniffed the air. Then it did something unmistakably intelligent. It stepped sideways, keeping a safe, respectful distance from Henry and his dogs. It wasn't hunting him. It was passing through his space, just as wolves and men sometimes do when crossing the same land. Henry's dogs were trembling, but the creature made no move to threaten them. It paused again, just long enough to look directly at Henry, with an expression he later described as a thinking face, not a wild face. Then, with a fluid motion shockingly graceful for its size, it turned and walked across the valley floor, long strides, arms swinging like a practiced endurance walker, heading toward a narrow band of spruce at the base of a distant hill. Within moments, its dark silhouette merged with the trees and vanished completely. The valley exhaled, the ravens returned, the wind loosened. Henry checked the ridge the next morning. He found bare footprints, massive, wide, deeply pressed into frozen moss. Toe impressions splayed like a cold climate runner gripping the tundra, a stride length around 5 feet. One spruce branch snapped 8 feet above ground level. A faint musk lingering in the cold air. Earthy, animal, but strangely clean. Henry made one final note in his small, weather-stained field book. This place is older than us. Some things in it also older. For the rest of his life, he refused to say he'd seen Bigfoot. He used a different phrase, the Watcher of the Valley, a being that crossed paths with him not out of fear, not out of aggression, but because the land was shared, and sometimes the old inhabitants still walk it. Sighting 5. The Ozark Creek Siege, 1983. The cabin no one returned to. The Ozarks have always held a special kind of quiet, a dense, humid stillness under oak and hickory canopies where sound doesn't travel so much as sink into the soil. In 1983, that quiet shattered for one family staying at a hunting cabin near Big Piney Creek, deep in the backcountry of northern Arkansas. To this day, the structure still stands, rotting, overgrown, and never lived in again. The family never returned. Not after what happened. Their story, pieced together from emergency logs, the written testimony of a frightened 14-year-old boy who is now a grown man, and the recollections of the sheriff's deputy who responded to the call, remains one of the most unnerving Bigfoot encounters ever whispered about in the Ozarks. In late October 1983, Earl and Janice Whitaker, along with their 2 children, Mark, 14, and Jenny, 11, drove out to Earl's uncle's long unused cabin. The place had no electricity, a hand pump for water, and a tin roof that pinged under acorns. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend of hunting, fishing, and storytelling around the wood stove. But on the second night, Mark noticed something strange. At 9:47 p.m., as recorded later in his journal, he wrote, "Something walking out there, heavy, not deer, not bear, walking like people." His father dismissed it. The woods make sounds, especially in October winds. But Mark wasn't convinced. When everyone went to bed, he stayed awake on his cot, staring at the thin curtain that covered the cabin's only window facing the creek. That's when the tapping started. Not wind, not acorns, 3 taps, spaced evenly. Tap, tap, tap. Mark froze. Then the tapping came again. This time heavier. A deliberate knuckle or fingernail against the old glass. Tap, tap, tap. When he lifted the curtain, expecting a prank or a raccoon, he saw an eye, not human, huge, dark, reflective, pressed close enough to the glass to fog it with breath. He screamed. Earl came running, rifle in hand, and yanked the curtain aside. The face vanished instantly, followed by the sound of something massive moving through leaves. But that was only the beginning. At 10:36 p.m., something heavy hit the side of the cabin. A deep, resonant thud that shook dust from the rafters. Then another, and another, not rapid, not panicked, testing. The cabin had no exterior lights. The only illumination came from the wood stove's orange glow. Earl stood at the door with his rifle, but he didn't dare open it. The sounds outside circled the cabin, slow, deliberate footfalls. Then came the breathing, low, deep, rhythmic. a sound so heavy it vibrated through the thin plank walls. Janice gathered the children in the middle of the room. Earl whispered without turning, "There's more than one." They heard it too, something moving on the roof, pacing. Something else dragging its hand along the wall boards. Slow, scraping fingers. Something clicking stones together behind the cabin, signaling. At 11:12 p.m., the doorknob began to turn. Not violently, not shaking, just a slow, exploratory twist, as if a curious hand was testing the mechanism. Earl raised the rifle. Janice sobbed quietly. The children clutched each other. The turning stopped. A single enormous silhouette filled the window. Broad shoulders, conical head, long arms at its sides. The creature stood completely still, observing them through the thin sheet of glass. Then another silhouette appeared beside it. Smaller, a juvenile. The two stood in eerie silence. Finally, the larger one leaned forward and exhaled, fogging the glass from the outside. Janice whispered, "They're not hunting, they're watching." Without warning, a series of sharp whistles echoed from the direction of the creek. 3 short blasts, a long one. The two silhouettes vanished instantly, sprinting into the dark with terrifying speed. Branches snapped. The roof thudded once as something heavy dropped off the backside. Then, nothing. Silence returned. The siege was over, but the Whitakers didn't sleep. At first light, they packed the truck and left, speeding down the rutted dirt trail so fast the shocks bottomed out. They never returned to the cabin. The sheriff's deputy who later inspected the site found deep footprints, 2 adult-sized, 1 smaller, circling the cabin, scrape marks on the wooden siding 8 feet above ground, a heavy stone placed on the porch as if intentionally left, a patch of coarse brown hair fibers snagged on the window latch, the faint smell of musk lingering in still morning air. The deputy privately told a colleague, whatever it was, it knew exactly what it was doing. It wanted them scared, but not harmed. The cabin stands to this day, unused and slowly being reclaimed by the Ozarks, a forgotten monument to a long, terrifying night when a family realized they weren't alone in the woods. Sighting 6. The Mount Shasta Nightwalker, 1991. The Camper's Whispering Guest. Mount Shasta is a place wrapped in layers of legend, of silence, of snow and mist and stories people tell only when certain no one else is listening. UFO sightings, spiritual visions, lost civilizations whispered about by hikers and mystics. But in 1991, a young solo camper discovered that some of the mountain's oldest stories weren't about the sky or ancient cities, but about something walking quietly through the trees, something that watches tense the way a curious neighbor watches a porch light, something that whispers. The man, Daniel Roswell, was a 24-year-old college student from Redding who often camped alone on long weekends. He liked the solitude. He liked the clean mountain air, and he liked being close to the silence of the Shasta wilderness. But after one night, he never camped alone again. Daniel set up camp about 2 miles east of Panther Meadow, in a clearing beside a dry creek bed where ancient volcanic stones lay scattered like forgotten bones. The evening was calm. The mountain glowed under a sheet of starlight. He cooked dinner over a small flame, zipped into his tent, and fell asleep, listening to the faint, distant calls of mountain owls. At 2:41 a.m., he woke up abruptly, not to a noise, but to the absence of all noise. No insects, no wind, no owl calls. Just a pressure in the air, an awareness that something was nearby. Daniel stayed still, trying to hear anything. Then came a sound he would never forget. Soft, deliberate footfalls just outside his tent. Not 4-legged, 2-legged, and heavy. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, methodically, like something trying to understand the strange nylon dome in its territory. Daniel held his breath and grabbed his flashlight, but he didn't dare turn it on. The creature stopped at the back of the tent. Daniel could feel it there, its presence like a weight pressing down on the earth. Then, impossibly, came a new sound. Breathing, slow, heavy, human, but not. When the creature shifted, the nylon wall brushed against Daniel's sleeping bag. He said later, "It wasn't sniffing me. It wasn't growling. It was listening." At 2:49 a.m., Daniel heard something that haunts him to this day. A whisper. Right outside his tent door, not words, not language, just a low rhythmic huh, a murmuring sound that carried intention, not instinct. The whispering rose and fell, as if the creature were speaking to itself or communicating with something else nearby. Daniel froze. He knew there was no one else around. He hadn't seen another hiker all day. Then, from farther away, deeper in the trees, came a second whisper. Lower, shorter, answering, there were two of them. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he thought the creatures might hear it. He clutched his flashlight and decided, if the tent zipper moved, he would blind them and run. But the zipper never moved. A massive handprint pressed into the side of the tent, slowly, carefully. Daniel watched the fabric stretch inward around thick fingers, each spaced far apart, the palm enormous and flat. The creature didn't press hard. It didn't test the tent for weakness, and it simply touched it. As if trying to understand the shape of the being inside, Daniel whispered, barely audible, "Please go." The hand froze, then it withdrew. The whispering returned, but now farther away, as the two creatures moved back into the tree line, communicating quietly in their murmur-like vocalizations. Moments later, Daniel heard footsteps retreating uphill, a long, loping pace, smooth and shockingly fast. The forest slowly came alive again. Wind returned, insects resumed. Owls called. The silence broke as though the mountain itself exhaled. Daniel unzipped his tent at dawn with shaking hands. The early light revealed massive footprints, bare, wide, deeply pressed into volcanic soil. Two sets, one large, one slightly smaller. A clear handprint on the tent fabric. 5 full fingers, nearly twice the span of a grown man's. A broken branch roughly 9 feet above ground, and a stone, smooth and round, placed deliberately in front of his tent door, as if left intentionally. Daniel packed his gear and left the mountain as fast as he safely could. He never camped alone again. Years later, when asked what he thought the creature wanted, Daniel always gave the same answer. It wasn't after me. It was curious about me. It wanted to understand who slept inside that little tent. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps Mount Shasta's night walkers are not hunters, but observers. Ancient watchers of a mountain older than our modern stories. Sighting 7, the Tennessee Trail Phantom, 1997. The bowhunter's silent stalker. The hills of eastern Tennessee are thick with stories, whispered around fire pits, murmured at deer camp, or shared on porches late at night when the cicadas drone like an ancient engine. But every so often a story emerges that even seasoned hunters refuse to laugh at. This one comes from October 1997, deep in the hardwood forests outside Roan Mountain, where a bowhunter encountered something that moved with quiet intelligence. Too quiet, too deliberate, too intentional to be any known animal. The man behind the sighting, Caleb Mercer, was a lifelong hunter who knew the Tennessee backwoods better than most men know their living rooms. He was patient, cautious, and utterly devoted to silence. Yet something out there was better at it than he was. Caleb entered the forest before dawn, longbow slung over his shoulder, boots greased for quiet travel. The leaves were damp. The air was cool. Sunrise filtered weakly through the maples and poplars. By mid-morning, he had taken position along a ridge trail, overlooking a steep ravine, a place where deer often crossed. He sat perfectly still for nearly 40 minutes. Then he noticed it. The forest was wrong. No squirrel chatter, no shifting brush, no woodpeckers, just a heavy quiet, as if every creature had retreated. Caleb wrote years later, "I've hunted in silence plenty, but this wasn't silence. This was everything trying not to be heard. Caleb moved softly along the trail, heading toward a small clearing. Each step was careful, placed on damp leaves. Then, from 40 or 50 yards behind him, came another step, matching his rhythm, matching his pace. When he stopped, it stopped. When he resumed moving, it resumed. At first he thought it was another hunter, but no hunter moves that quietly. Caleb crouched, waited, listened. A soft exhale drifted through the woods, not human, not quite animal, something in between. A low, steady breath released with intentional control. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. Through a gap between two poplars, Caleb saw movement. A shape. Not dark brown like a bear. Not tan like a deer. Black, tall, broad-shouldered, and walking upright on two legs. It stepped behind a tree with a smoothness Caleb had only ever seen in expert hunters and military scouts. He knocked an arrow. Not to shoot, but because instinct demanded it. The figure stayed behind the tree for several seconds. Caleb watched its outline shift with unnerving patience. Then it leaned out. Just enough for Caleb to see. Shoulders nearly as wide as the tree trunk, arms long and muscular hanging low. A head covered in dense dark hair. Eyes deep and reflective, studying him calmly. The outline of a chest that rose and fell like a bellows. Caleb blinked, and in that instant, the creature vanished behind the tree, without a sound. He didn't hear it run. He didn't hear it jump. He didn't hear it climb. It was simply gone. 10 minutes later, Caleb moved down the trail toward the clearing. He kept his breathing steady, listening constantly. Then, from the right side of the trail, a soft whistle, not a bird call, and too low, too controlled. Caleb froze, turning slowly. 30 yards away, half hidden by brush, stood the creature. Upright, perfectly still. It watched him. Caleb felt the sensation of being measured, like a deer under a scope. The creature's mouth opened slightly. It made another sound, a low, resonant rumble, almost like a bass note. Not aggression. A warning. The message was clear. Turn back. Caleb lowered his bow. He backed away slowly, one step at a time. The creature did not follow. It simply watched until Caleb put 40 yards between them, then stepped behind a deadfall log and disappeared into the trees with shocking grace, barely disturbing the leaves. Caleb reached his truck, trembling. His hands shook so violently he couldn't put the key in the ignition at first. He never returned to that ridge. And he sold the bow 2 years later, telling friends he just didn't hunt anymore. But decades later, when asked what he saw, Caleb always gave the same response. It walked like a man, hid like a cougar, and watched me like it was thinking. To this day, locals call the ravine the Phantom's Trail, though the name is never printed on maps. Sighting 8. The Cascadia Scree-Slide Encounter, 2004. The Climber Who Was Warned. Some encounters are distant silhouettes. Some are nighttime terrors. But this one is different because it happened in the open, in broad daylight, at high elevation, where visibility is perfect and excuses grow thin. In August 2004, an experienced solo climber named Marta Ellison was scaling a remote ridge near the Three Sisters Wilderness in central Oregon. Marta wasn't a thrill seeker. She was a methodical, disciplined mountaineer who avoided risk. She had logged dozens of climbs across Cascadia and kept a meticulous record of route conditions, rock quality, and weather patterns. Her notes, reviewed years later by a hiking partner, contain one entry marked with a red pen. "This is the day the mountain warned me." What she meant by that wouldn't become clear until she told the full story. Marta was ascending a steep slope of loose volcanic scree, charcoal gray rock shards that shift underfoot like ball bearings. Climbers dread scree fields. They're unstable, loud, and dangerous. But Marta needed to cross this one to reach a saddle on the ridge. Halfway across, she felt the rocks move behind her. Not sliding dash, stepping. Something was coming across the scree, something heavy. At first she assumed it was a mountain goat or another climber, but the rhythm was wrong. Long pauses, then sudden wait, then another long pause. Controlled foot placement like someone testing each step. Marta stopped, looked back, and froze. 30 yards below her stood a massive upright figure navigating the unstable scree with impossible skill. Marta's training kicked in immediately. She observed, catalogued, analyzed. Her description was detailed. 7 to 8 feet tall, extremely broad-chested, legs thicker than any athlete she'd ever seen, covered in long, dark, reddish-brown hair that moved in the wind. A slight forward lean but unmistakably bipedal, arms swinging naturally but low, fingertips nearly brushing rock. Bare feet, wide, powerful, gripping scree the way a climber uses specialized shoes. A face with deep-set eyes and a pronounced brow shadow. But the most unsettling detail was the creature's control. Every step it took was precise. It didn't slip, it didn't slide, and its balance was perfect. Marta later said, its body language wasn't animal fear or aggression. It was evaluating me. The signal. The creature took one more step. Then something remarkable happened. It lifted its right arm, slowly, deliberately, and made a pushing motion toward Marta. Hand forward, palm out. A gesture universal among humans. Stop. Do not come this way. It's dangerous. Marta felt confusion wash over her. Was the creature warning her? As if to say, the scree above is unstable. She hesitated, and made a small instinctive nod. A tiny acknowledgement. The creature froze, and then lowered its arm. Just then, a section of scree farther uphill shifted in a sudden cascade, a loose slide triggered by the morning thaw. Marta watched in horror as hundreds of pounds of sharp volcanic rock tumbled down the exact path she had been heading toward. If she had continued climbing, she would have been directly in its path. The creature had somehow known. Once the rockslide settled, the creature did not approach Marta. It did not vocalize. It simply stepped sideways, keeping a safe distance, and descended the scree field with fluid ease. Marta called out, softly, more instinct than rationale. "Thank you." The creature paused at the bottom of the slope, turned its head slightly, then slipped through a stand of twisted white bark pines and disappeared. Its movements were so smooth, so shockingly quiet, that the forest seemed to swallow it whole. Marta stood trembling on the slope for several minutes before continuing her climb, taking an alternate path that avoided the unstable area entirely. When she reached the ridge saddle, she found something placed on a flat rock, a single rounded stone, polished by water, not native to the scree field, placed intentionally. She left it untouched. When Marta descended the mountain, she documented everything. The approximate height and build, the scree conditions, the weather patterns that caused the slide, the footprint impressions she found, wide, barefoot, deep, the precise location of the warning gesture. She told only one person for many years, her climbing partner. But she wrote one final line in her notebook, the one that explains why she marked this date so boldly. Something on that mountain understood my danger before I did. And whether that something was a relic hominin, a forest giant, or simply an unknown guardian of the Cascades, Marta never doubted what she saw. Sighting 9. The Florida Mangrove Walker, 2011. The Kayaker's Midnight Crossing. Florida's mangrove estuaries are beautiful in the day. Green tunnels of intertwined roots, brackish water alive with mullet and darting shadows, egrets stalking along the shallows. But at night, under moonlight, the mangroves become something else entirely. A labyrinth of silhouettes, slick roots, and strange echoes. Most people never enter them after dark. In 2011, a kayaker named Luis Caballero learned exactly why. Luis was a part-time fishing guide near Everglades City, a patient and practical man. He'd logged countless hours navigating the maze-like mangrove creeks, so when he set out late one night to retrieve a forgotten tackle box left at a daytime fishing spot, he expected nothing more than mosquitoes and the occasional curious raccoon. What he didn't expect was company. Company that moved through the water as quietly as a shadow, and watched him from the roots of the trees. Luis launched his kayak under a bright, cloudless moon. The tide was slack, the water glassy. The mangroves formed natural tunnels around him, their roots arching overhead like cathedral vaults. He paddled for 20 minutes before noticing something unusual. No fish were breaking the surface. No herons called. No insects hummed. The estuary was dead silent. Luis dipped his paddle again, and then froze because something made a ripple in the water beside his kayak, a large ripple. Not from a gator, not from a manatee. Something walking, something upright. Luis shone his small headlamp toward the mangrove wall. Between the roots stood a massive figure, half submerged in the tidal channel. At first he thought it was a fisherman in waders, but no human in waders stood that tall or that broad. The creature's silhouette resolved, 7 to 8 feet tall, torso thick as a storm-swollen log, arms hanging low, nearly touching the water's surface, hair matted and dripping, dark as wet peat, chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths, bare legs visible underwater, muscular, rooted in the mud like mangrove trunks, eyes catching the headlamp with a dim amber reflection. It wasn't startled and it wasn't hiding, it was waiting. Luis's breath hitched. The creature slowly leaned forward just enough for him to see its face, wide, heavy-browed, and deeply shadowed beneath a crown of tangled hair. Luis whispered, barely audible, "No puede ser." It blinked once. Then Luis realized something else. It wasn't alone. A second shape surfaced to the right, smaller, quieter, only its head and shoulders breaking the water's skin. It moved with slow, gliding ease, making almost no noise. This one was younger, same massive shoulders but less bulk. Its eyes were dark, curious, intelligent. The first creature exhaled slowly, sending ripples across the water. The air thickened. Luis felt something primal pull at the back of his skull, a deep instinct telling him to stay still. The larger creature stepped forward, displacing water with a low surge. Luis's kayak rocked dangerously. Then, in a calm, astonishingly deliberate motion, the creature placed its enormous hand on a mangrove root, blocking the narrow channel ahead. Not threatening, not aggressive, a barrier, a message, do not pass, turn back. Luis swallowed hard. He raised both hands slowly, palms outward. A universal gesture of peace or surrender. The creature tilted its head. Then it made a sound, a deep, bubbling haruam, resonant in the water like a foghorn heard underwater. From behind Luis, deeper in the mangrove maze, another call answered. Distant, but clearly of the same species. This was their place, their night, their channel. Luis was the intruder. He dipped his paddle softly, turning the kayak. Neither creature pursued. The large one stepped backward into deeper water, lowering itself until only its head and shoulders remained above the surface. The smaller one moved beside it, gliding as silently as before. They watched him go, not with hostility, but with the same measured curiosity seen in other encounters across the continent. When Luis reached open water, he dared one last look back. Both figures were gone, only gentle ripples remained. The next morning, Luis returned with a friend during high tide. They found massive footprints in soft mud between mangrove roots, clear toe impressions, wider than any human's, long drag marks from where something had shifted its weight underwater. A mangrove root snapped 6 feet above the waterline, the faint musk of something earthy, organic, and wild. Luis told only a handful of people. Most didn't believe him. But the fishing guide, who had never feared gators, sharks, or storms, never again paddled the mangrove channels after dark. He still calls the creature El Caminante, the walker, because what he saw that night walked where no human dares to walk. Sighting 10. The Alberta Foothill Howler, 2020. The Snowstorm Pursuit. Winter in the Alberta foothills is not merely a season. It's an occupation, a force that sets its own rules, a cold that erases sound, shape, and even memory if you linger too long. But in January 2020, when an unexpected whiteout rolled over the eastern slopes of the Rockies near Caroline, Alberta, a backcountry hunter named Miles Varick discovered that snowstorms can reveal things just as easily as they hide them. He swears to this day that he wasn't alone in the storm, that something kept pace with him, unseen but unmistakably close, something that hunted with patience, intelligence, and purpose, and something that finally decided to show itself. Miles had hunted the foothills for over 30 years. He could read terrain the way some people read street signs. But on January 6th, a forecasted mild snowfall became a raging whiteout in less than an hour, visibility collapsing into a swirling wall of white. He was 5 kilometers from his truck, moving along a narrow cut-line trail. The wind screamed through the pines like a siren. Snow whipped sideways, erasing his footprints behind him. Then the woods went quiet. The wind still blew, the storm still raged, but the forest, the living forest, fell silent. Miles later said, "When a storm goes bad, you feel the cold. But when the woods go bad, you feel watched." And that's exactly what happened. At first, Miles thought the sound was branches cracking under wind pressure. But no. These were footsteps, soft but heavy, paced between gusts. They came from the tree line to his left, matching his speed, staying parallel in perfect formation. He paused. So did the footsteps. He took 2 slow steps. So did the unseen creature. Through blowing snow, he saw only a blur of movement, dark, massive, weaving between trees like a shadow with weight. Miles tightened his grip on his rifle. Something answered with a sound that lifted the hair on his arms. A long, low howl, too deep for wolves, too controlled for wind, too resonant to be anything but a voice. Miles continued forward, heartbeat pounding like a drum inside his parka. The creature shadowed him for nearly a kilometer, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, always invisible behind the storm's curtain. Then the wind shifted, just for a moment, enough to tear open the veil of snow. And Miles saw it, standing between 2 pines partially obscured by swirling flakes 8 to 9 feet tall, hunched slightly against the storm. Shoulders so broad they nearly brushed both trees. Arms long and thick, swinging slowly at its sides. Entire body covered in dense frost-lined hair. Skin around the face grayish with cold. Eyes glowing a muted amber, focused entirely on him. Breath steaming in huge rhythmic plumes. Most striking of all, it was standing still, bracing itself with one hand against a tree, as if observing him, measuring him, deciding. Miles said the creature appeared not frantic or lost, but utterly comfortable in the storm, like a polar predator perfectly adapted to the chaos. The creature stepped forward, and the snow muted its movement. The ground didn't crunch, the tree branches didn't shake. It approached with supernatural stealth. Miles backed away. The creature tilted its head, not aggressively but analytically, and let out a sound that was almost a question, a short rising whoop, followed by a deep whoo. Miles didn't answer. He couldn't. The creature began to circle him, always partially veiled by the wind. He glimpsed its silhouette repeatedly, huge, fast, deliberate, moving in a broad arc as if herding him back toward the cut line. Miles understood the message. Leave, now. As Miles neared the edge of the tree line, the creature appeared again. Closer this time, only 15 meters away. It placed one enormous foot into the open snow, deliberately leaving a print. Then it lifted its head and unleashed a terrifying, ground-shaking howl. a roar that vibrated through the soles of Miles's boots. Not a threat, not a challenge, a boundary and a declaration, "This is my storm." Miles turned and ran, not blindly but with the controlled desperation of a man who understood he'd been spared, not chased. He reached his truck nearly an hour later, half frozen, half delirious, and shaking so hard he couldn't put the key into the ignition. The next day, after the storm cleared, Miles returned with 2 friends. They found one enormous footprint exactly where he'd seen it, toes splayed wide, nearly 1.5 feet long, pressed so deep the snow compacted into ice, no other tracks nearby, none leading away. As if the creature had stepped from the storm itself and returned to it. Miles never hunted those foothills again, but he still hears that howl in his dreams, a sound deeper than any wolf, older than any winter, echoing through the whiteout that tried to swallow him whole.